Hi and welcome to this video. I'm going to talk a bit about the fantasy genre. How to define fantasy, a type of literature that deals with phenomena outside our known reality is one way of talking about fantasy. There are different levels of fantasy elements in books and texts. For instance, I think probably the most famous kind of fantasy is the one that's called high fantasy, which is very much based on the way that Tolkien wrote and created. So the story takes place in a secondary world, which is, a different world from our own, even though obviously there are resemblances. The secondary world is often inspired by the Middle Ages, concerning, the way people dress, weapon armory, and then the knight culture and influences like that. There can also be a parallel world to the one that we recognize. For instance, the Narnia books start out in our reality, and then the children are transported through some kind of portal. In this case, it begins with a wardrobe, and then are being transported into a different world from ours, in this case, the Narnia world. But the parallel world can also exist within our reality. For instance, the Harry Potter books, where we recognize most everything. It's modern time, London, etc. But there is a whole community with wizards actually existing alongside the reality that we recognize. So that's another way of working with the parallel world concept. And it can also be mostly a modern setting in a reality that we recognize, but supernatural elements are brought into the story. I would say, for instance, Twilight could be an example of that way to use fantasy. Fantasy is a relatively modern genre. It has its roots very much in fairy tales, but it is more complex than fairy tales. One important thing with fantasy is the concept of inner logic. And I probably think it's harder to write fantasy than write realistic novels or stories, because you have to invent so much for yourself, as we can see that Tolkien obviously did, maybe one of the people who did that most. Because if you have supernatural elements, for instance, if people can do magic, if magic is a natural state in the world that you are creating, you have to construct laws of nature, which deals with this and limits the use of magic. Because if you would write a story where a magician could do anything and everything without limitations or consequences, it wouldn't really be interesting or logical. So you have to sort of create your own laws of nature and rules. And I think this is important when you write fantastic literature, because while you are reading the book, you have to believe it. This is called the suspension of disbeliefs. So even if I don't actually believe there are dragons in our world, if I'm reading a book in which world dragons are natural, then I have to believe it while I'm reading it. So that is called the suspension of disbelief. So that's the first part, a definition of fantasy. In the next part, I'm going to talk about the literary history of fantasy, how it has grown and developed. So see you in the next part. Bye.